On December 20, 2021, an Emirates Boeing 777 carrying about 354 people almost crashed right after taking off from Dubai. It happened just a few days ago, and we're already hearing things that make you wonder if pilots rely too much on automation. Plus, it raises some big questions about the safety culture at Emirates, one of the top airlines in the world. This incident might end up being one of the most interesting case studies on human error we've seen in a while. So, here's what went down. Emirates Flight 231 was set to leave Dubai just before 3 a.m., heading to Washington, D.C. It's a 14-hour flight, so there were 4 pilots on board, 2 for takeoff and the other 2 to take over later. Plane was a Boeing 777, only 4 years old, which had flown in from Zurich 2 days before. The 777 is super modern and known for being safe and fuel efficient, so it's no surprise Emirates, the largest operator of the 777, has 153 of them. As the plane taxied out to the runway, the weather was perfect. Clear skies, 21 degrees Celsius, no wind. 3:09 a.m., the pilots lined up and started the takeoff. They quickly hit the normal speed of 270 kilometers per hour but didn't lift off. Instead, they kept going faster down the runway. By the time they hit 400 kilometers per hour, they finally took off but had already run off the end of the runway. But here's the scary part. Instead of climbing away safely, the plane was flying just 75 feet above some residential buildings near the airport, going nearly 500 kilometers per hour. To put that in perspective, 75 feet is shorter than the wingspan of the plane. They barely missed hitting some apartment buildings in a busy area of Dubai. Then, a few seconds later, the pilots pulled up sharply and got back on their normal route. Instead of turning back to Dubai, they continued the flight to Washington, D.C. and landed safely. There are reports that the plane might have been damaged during takeoff, but it returned to Dubai like normal. Later that day, the plane was grounded for 4 days to be inspected for damage. First, there were rumors that all 4 pilots on board had been fired, but it turns out that wasn't true. It's hard to figure out what caused such a close call, but a big clue came up a week after the incident. Emirates sent out a notice to all its pilots, which basically said, "Don't change the altitude in the autopilot panel after landing." This notice was a response to past issues where planes had problems during takeoff because the previous crew set the autopilot altitude to 0 after landing. It's likely that this is what happened with Flight 231. Previous crew may have set the altitude to 0 after landing in Dubai, and the new pilots didn't catch it before taking off for Washington. If that's the case, it's a serious mistake, especially with 4 pilots in the cockpit. We don't have all the details yet, but it seems like human error played a big role, more specifically a series of nearly disastrous mistakes. Normally, pilots are supposed to check the altitude setting on the autopilot multiple times before takeoff. They set it after getting clearance from air traffic control and then double-check it several times before getting airborne. The notice from Emirates also suggests that during takeoff, the pilots might have been blindly following the flight director, a system that guides the pilot based on the autopilot settings. If the altitude was set to 0, the flight director would have told them to keep the plane level with the horizon instead of lifting off when they reached takeoff speed. In other words, the pilot flying the plane might have been too focused on following the instruments and didn't use common sense to lift off when they should have. If this is what happened, it also means the other pilot, who was supposed to be monitoring the situation, wasn't doing a great job of catching the mistake. It wasn't until they ran out of runway that they finally got the plane airborne, but instead of climbing, they stayed dangerously close to the ground, flying faster than normal at a height lower than the plane's wingspan. At some point, they finally pulled up and climbed to safety, but before that, they were just seconds away from a crash that could have killed everyone on board and many people on the ground. If they hadn't acted when they did, this could have been one of the worst air disasters of the century. This close call really makes you question how much pilots rely on automation. It's possible that the crew of Flight 231 got so used to relying on autopilot that they ignored basic information like their airspeed and altitude. It's unlikely that this was a mechanical problem because if it had been, they would have turned back to Dubai immediately rather than risking flying over the Atlantic. Online forums where pilots discuss these incidents suggest that automation dependency might be to blame. At Emirates, pilots are trained to use the highest level of automation available for almost every part of the flight. They even enter approaches into the flight management computer and let the autopilot handle them. Sometimes they might just follow the flight director's instructions instead of looking outside. This heavy reliance on automation can erode manual flying skills, leaving pilots less confident in handling the plane themselves and more like managers of the automation systems. In the US, the approach is different. Pilots are encouraged to fly manually to keep their skills sharp. They'll use the autopilot to reduce workload but still take control manually, especially during critical phases like takeoff and landing. The focus is on flying the aircraft first, and automation is used to assist when needed. The issue with relying too much on automation is clear in cases like Flight 231. When the autopilot or flight director is not set up correctly, pilots can get stuck. For Flight 231, when the flight director gave incorrect instructions, the pilot should have relied on their basic flying skills and brought the plane into the air even if the autopilot wasn't indicating it. The fact that the aircraft went off the end of the runway before taking off suggests a serious lapse in judgment. And with up to 4 pilots in the cockpit, this wasn't just one person's mistake. It points to a broader issue with how the crew managed the situation. All this points to a problem with how pilots are trained and how automation is used in the industry. Long-haul pilots, who fly fewer takeoffs and landings compared to short-haul pilots, might end up relying too heavily on automation and lose touch with their flying skills. Fatigue, especially on a late-night flight, could also have played a role in this incident. In a few weeks, this incident will likely be forgotten by the news, but it's important to remember how close this flight came to a major disaster. The scenarios discussed here turn out to be true. Serious issues with pilot training and company safety culture are to blame. Emirates is known for its excellent safety record and rigorous pilot training, and its fleet is modern and well-maintained. However, this incident highlights growing concerns about automation reliance and crew resource management. This wasn't the first close call for Emirates. Back in 2016, a Boeing 777 crashed on landing in Dubai after the pilots mishandled the automation during a failed go-around attempt. The aircraft caught fire, and while everyone on board was evacuated, 32 people were injured seriously, and a firefighter lost his life due to an explosion during the post-crash fire. Emirates isn't alone in facing the problem of automation dependency. This issue has been known since the 1990s and has led to several high-profile crashes. For instance, Air France Flight 447 crashed off Brazil in 2009, killing all 228 people on board, and Asiana Flight 214 crashed short of the runway in San Francisco in 2013, injuring 187 passengers and killing 3. Close calls like Flight 231 show that automation dependency remains a significant problem. Unless there are major changes in pilot training, we might be facing another serious accident soon. If you found this video interesting, consider subscribing for updates on air accidents. And if you have ideas for future episodes, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.